Hello and welcome to a classic episode of How to Paint. Today we're looking at Iden Versio's Inferno Squad. These are some very cool looking miniatures, so let's dive in. These miniatures can be found in the Star Wars Shatterpoint expansion, Today the Rebellion Dies. So I'm starting off by snipping out the pieces, and after some cleanup, I'm then gluing them together with some classic plastic glue. And then once the miniature is built, I then use super glue to attach them to the base. I'm going to begin a traditional prime with some black primer, and this is applied all over the miniature and from underneath, from above, just to get full coverage. And then I take a white primer and spray from roughly above, normally about 45 degrees, to make sure I get the faces and all the details. I'm going to start off today with Occultist Cloak. This is a speed paint, so over this white prime it's going to really sink nicely into those recesses, but still reveal those highlights. I'm applying this all over for right now. And then I'm switching out to a Grim Black, and I'm using this over the top, and I'm applying this to the boots, the gloves, any kind of leather or plastic, because what I'm hoping to achieve is basically two different textures. I want some of the shinier areas to be a darker black, whereas the jumpsuit I want to be kind of a dark grey. In Star Wars Battlefront 2, these guys are just all in black, and I could have done that, but I didn't want it to be that boring. So with this, I thought this would be a pretty good challenge to try to get two different materials out of effectively two different colors, but still make it look like black. So I'm using this Grim Black for any of the helmets, any of the pouches, leather straps, anything like that. Next I'm using Russ Grey as a highlight for the jumpsuit. So I'm kind of leaning into that bluish grey that the original contrast paint left behind, and I'm highlighting with honestly a fairly light color. This is as high as I want to go for highlights on the jumpsuit, but I'm going to take the highlights on the leather a lot higher. I'm using the contrast paint as a roadmap to kind of tell me where to put my highlights. So any of these areas that have come through as almost white, I'm just hitting with some of that rust grey and just bringing some color back into that highlight. I couldn't resist adding these details in early on, so I'm using Mephiston red, and I'm doing that pinstripe that runs all the way down the suit. Some of these models do have the sculpt, and some of them you kind of have to guess, but there is a seam that you can use as a guide. And then because the patch is raised as well, which is super handy, I'm using the edge of the brush and letting that Mephiston red catch on the sculpt itself. Next I'm using coal black and bold titanium white, and I'm mixing these together to make almost a palette of neutral greys that I can use as highlights for these black sections. So this is starting off with a fairly dark grey, and I'm just adding in some very liberal highlights. I'm almost just kind of dry brushing on these highlights here. This difference in color will definitely help distinguish the two materials, but still stay within the black tones that I'm hoping to achieve. There's no real rhyme or reason for these shapes or these highlights. I'm just kind of focusing on some of the more upturned areas on the sculpt, and I'm just letting that brush just kind of find its own shape on those areas. Now I'm mixing into honestly a neutral grey, and I'm using this as my main highlight. I'm focusing it in the middle of that dark grey that I've already done, but I'm just making it a little bit smaller and kind of furrowing the lines a little bit to kind of give the impression that highlight is reflecting off the surface here. Once I'm happy with that layer, I'll then go in with a fairly light grey. This is pretty close to white now, and I'm just adding in just a smaller highlight. And again, focusing in the middle of the previous highlight, getting smaller and smaller and less of it. And then finally, I'm using a pure white and just doing a specular highlight on some of those highest areas of intensity. So this is focused mainly on the creases on the boots here and some of the smaller areas where I've kind of thinned down that highlight. And you can see with just 2 or 3 different tones, you can make an effective highlight on a non-metallic surface, as well as being fairly quick too. Next, I'm taking that Mephiston red and applying it to the lenses on any of the characters with helmets. And then I'm using that for the markings on the side of the helmet as well. I've had these decals way back from the days of when these guys came out in Star Wars Legion, and their size is actually fairly comparable, so I'm going to be using these for some of the smaller details on the helmet. You could of course freehand these using the patches on the sides of the uniform as a guide, but this for me was just a little bit quicker. And as always, I will leave a link in the description to where I found these. While I had these colours on the palette, I'm going to go through and just add some of those smaller details like the lights on the chest. And for some of the blue lights, I'm using Caledor Sky. Next, I'm going to start work on the faces. So starting with Iden, we're going to use basic flesh. And I'm just doing an all-round coat over the whole of the face here. I'm also making sure that the paint is fairly thin, because if I start applying thick paint, it's going to obscure some of the more delicate features on the sculpt. And then I'm going to be using a Crusader skin speed paint, and I'm just applying this over the top of that initial coat. I could have, of course, just put this straight onto the prime if I wanted to tone that initial color, but what I felt was I wanted some warmth in the face to begin with, so I'm applying this over the initial base coat. This also helps to pull out some of those details that may have been lost with that single coat beforehand. And then I'm going back in with that initial color and just adding in some very early highlights. I'm almost covering over most of the work I've done, but I'm leaving those edges of the face and some of those deeper areas around the nose and the mouth in that Crusader skin tone. I'm also using the position of her head and the way the light would interact as kind of a rough guide for where my highlights are going to go. And speaking of highlights, I'm going to be using pale skin, and I'm slowly introducing this in stages to that initial flesh color. It's basically the same concept that I've been doing for the plastic areas on her armor or the gloves and the boots, but in flesh tones instead. So I've just mixed in a little bit of this pale flesh into the basic flesh, and I'm starting to layer in those highlights, getting smaller and smaller, focusing towards the tip of her nose and the cheeks. And then I'm using a little bit of Screamer Pink here, and I've mixed that into the basic flesh, and I'm just gently applying this to her lips. For the hair, I'm just using Grim Black as my base coat. And then I'm going to introduce Rhinox hide as a highlight. And again, I'm just making sure that the top half of her head is getting this. I've mixed a little bit of pale flesh in with that Rhinox hide to make a hair highlight tone here. And then to finish out Aiden, I'm going to just work on her little droid, ID-10. He doesn't need a lot of work. I'm just doing a quick gradient on these lenses with some of that Mephiston red, introducing some black and some white just to help build up those tones. Aiden's heavy repeater gun actually appeared in the first game, Jedi Knight 2, and I love that game so much. So to pay homage to that, the stock in that original game was green, so I'm just using this Caliban green to help tie in the reference there. And then lastly, I'm breaking up those bigger sections of black with just a quick dry brush on the guns. For the other two lads, I'm going to be using different skin tones here, so I'm using Bugman's Glow. This is a little bit more pink, and then I'm going to build up my highlights differently to help distinguish the difference in skin tones. So rather than using Crusader Flesh as a wash, I'm actually just using the Army Painter Flesh Wash, and this is fairly similar. Honestly, it's pretty close to being the same. This has a little bit more red and orange in it, and it complements the Bugman's Glow quite nicely. And as before, I'm using that Bugman's Glow again as my first highlight. And then it's at this stage I like to get the pupils in, so I'm doing just a quick white and a black just to dot in those pupils. It can be really messy, and then I'll tidy it up with that Bugman's Glow again. For the highlights on these faces, I'm using pink flesh this time around. Again, I'm building up to these kind of pinker, redder tones rather than the pale, basic tones as before. And then for the ultimate highlights on these faces, I'm using pale flesh. I mixed in a little bit of that Caledor sky into that pink flesh, and I got kind of a bluey, fleshy tone, and this is great for stubble. For Gideon Hask's hair, I'm using Iroko as a base tone. And then I've gone back to that flesh wash and just provided a quick shade on this, taking care not to let it drip on the face. And then for a highlight, I'm using Thar brown and just gently highlighting some of those higher areas on the hair. I've then used the exact same recipe for Delmico, and then for his hair, I've just done Grim Black. Lastly, the way I've been doing my Shatterpoint bases, I've been using Skrag brown as a base tone for any of the areas of dirt, and then a fairly dark grey for the metallic areas. Then once those are dry, I then do a quick dry brush of some grey and white on the metallics, and a dry brush of Iroko on the dirt. You could do these bases any way you like, but this is just to help match my previous characters. For the larger areas of metallic, I like to add just a little bit of blue in there. So this is a really watered down blue, and then I just take a wet brush and just feather the edges. And there they are, Inferno Squad. I was kind of daunting these guys because they're all black and I didn't want to just do something really boring like a contrast paint all over. So just being able to experiment with a kind of grayish blue, that really helped just make these guys a little bit more interesting and add some more visual interest. Plus, you know, painting faces is always a bit of a challenge, and I was glad that I didn't just do the helmeted look. I really enjoyed the concept of these guys in the Star Wars Battlefront 2 sequel, even if the campaign was a little short and they didn't get much screen time. But there we go, another box down. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Like the video if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and I will see you all in the next one.